Chapter 46 of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
I felt strongly tempted at times to enlighten my mother and sister on the real character and circumstances of the persecuted tenant of Wildfell Hall, and at first I greatly regretted having omitted to ask that lady's permission to do so. But on due reflection I considered that, if it were known to them, it could not long remain a secret to the Millwards and Wilsons, and such was my present appreciation of Eliza Millward's disposition, that, if once she got a clue to the story, I should fear she would soon find means to enlighten Mr. Huntingdon upon the place of his wife's retreat. I would therefore wait patiently till these weary 6 months were over, and then, when the fugitive had found another home, and I was permitted to write to her, I would beg to be allowed to clear her name from these vile calumnies. At present I must content myself with simply asserting that I knew them to be false, and would prove it some day, to the shame of those who slandered her. I don't think anybody believed me, but everybody soon learned to avoid insinuating a word against her, or even mentioning her name in my presence. They thought I was so madly infatuated by the seductions of that unhappy lady that I was determined to support her in the very face of reason, and meantime I grow insupportably morose and misanthropical, from the idea that every one I met was harbouring unworthy thoughts of the supposed Mrs. Graham, and would express them if he dared. My poor mother was quite distressed about me, but I couldn't help it. At least I thought I could not, though sometimes I felt a pang of remorse for my undutiful conduct to her, and made an effort to amend, attended with some partial success, and indeed I was generally more humanized in my demeanour to her than to anyone else, Mr. Lawrence excepted. Rose and Fergus usually shunned my presence, and it was well they did, for I was not fit company for them, nor they for me, under the present circumstances. Mrs. Huntingdon did not leave Wildfell Hall till above 2 months after our farewell interview. During that time she never appeared at church, and I never went near the house. I only knew she was still there by her brother's brief answers to my many and varied inquiries respecting her. I was a very constant and attentive visitor to him throughout the whole period of his illness and convalescence, not only from the interest I took in his recovery, and my desire to cheer him up and make the utmost possible amends for my former brutality, but from my growing attachment to himself, and the increasing pleasure I found in his society, partly from his increased cordiality to me, but chiefly on account of his close connection, both in blood and in affection, with my adored Helen. I loved him for it better than I liked to express, and I took a secret delight in pressing those slender white fingers, so marvellously like her own, considering he was not a woman, and in watching the passing changes in his fair, pale features, and observing the intonations of his voice, detecting resemblances which I wondered had never struck me before. He provoked me at times, indeed, by his evident reluctance to talk to me about his sister, though I did not question the friendliness of his motives in wishing to discourage my remembrance of her. His recovery was not quite so rapid as he had expected it to be. He was not able to mount his pony till a fortnight after the date of our reconciliation, and the first use he made of his returning strength was to ride over by night to Wildfell Hall to see his sister. It was a hazardous enterprise, both for him and for her, but he thought it necessary to consult with her on the subject of her projected departure, if not to calm her apprehensions respecting his health, and the worst result was a slight relapse of his illness, for no one knew of the visit but the inmates of the old hall, except myself, and I believe it had not been his intention to mention it to me, for when I came to see him the next day, and observed he was not so well as he ought to have been, he merely said he had caught cold by being out too late in the evening. "You'll never be able to see your sister if you don't take care of yourself," said I, a little provoked at the circumstance on her account, instead of commiserating him.
"I have seen her already,"
said he quietly. "You've seen her?" cried I in astonishment.
"Yes."
and then he told me what considerations had impelled him to make the venture, and with what precautions he had made it. And how was she? I eagerly asked.
As usual,
Was the brief though sad reply. As usual. That is far from happy and far from strong.
she is not positively ill,
Returned he.
and she will recover her spirits in a while, I have no doubt. But so many trials have been almost too much for her. How threatening those clouds look!
Continued he, turning towards the window.
We shall have thunder showers before midnight, I imagine, and they are just in the midst of stacking my corn. Have you got yours all in yet?
No. And Lawrence, did your sister mention me?
She asked if I had seen you lately.
And what else did she say?
I cannot tell you all she said,
Replied he, with a slight smile.
For we talked a good deal, though my stay was but short. But our conversation was chiefly on the subject of her intended departure, which I begged her to delay till I was better able to assist her in her search after another home.
But did she say no more about me?
She did not say much about you, Markham. I should not have encouraged her to do so had she been inclined. But happily she was not. She only asked a few questions concerning you, and seemed satisfied with my brief answers, wherein she showed herself wiser than her friend. And I may tell you, too, that she seemed to be far more anxious lest you should think too much of her, than lest you should forget her.
She was right.
But I fear your anxiety is quite the other way respecting her.
No, it is not. I wish her to be happy, but I don't wish her to forget me altogether. She knows it is impossible that I should forget her, and she is right to wish me not to remember her too well. I should not desire her to regret me too deeply, but I can scarcely imagine she will make herself very unhappy about me, because I know I am not worthy of it, except in my appreciation of her.
You are neither of you worthy of a broken heart, nor of all the sighs and tears and sorrowful thoughts that have been, and I fear will be, wasted upon you both. But at present each has a more exalted opinion of the other than, I fear, he or she deserves, and my sister's feelings are naturally full as keen as yours, and I believe more constant. But she has the good sense and fortitude to strive against them in this particular, and I trust she will not rest till she has entirely weaned her thoughts.
He hesitated. From me, said I.
And I wish you would make the like exertions.
Continued he. Did she tell you that was her intention?
No, the question was not broached between us. There was no necessity for it, for I had no doubt that such was her determination.
To forget me?
Yes, Markham. Why not?
Oh, well, was my only audible reply, but I internally answered, No, Lawrence, you're wrong there. She is not determined to forget me. It would be wrong to forget one, so deeply and fondly devoted to her, who can so thoroughly appreciate her excellencies, and sympathize with all her thoughts, as I can do. And it would be wrong in me to forget so excellent and divine a piece of God's creation as she, when I have once so truly loved and known her. But I said no more to him on that subject. I instantly started a new topic of conversation, and soon took leave of my companion, with a feeling of less cordiality towards him than usual. Perhaps I had no right to be annoyed at him, but I was so nevertheless. In little more than a week after this, I met him returning from a visit to the Wilsons, and I now resolved to do him a good turn, though at the expense of his feelings, and perhaps at the risk of incurring that displeasure which is so commonly the reward of those who give disagreeable information, or tender their advice unasked. In this, believe me, I was actuated by no motives of revenge for the occasional annoyances I had lately sustained from him, nor yet by any feeling of malevolent enmity towards Miss Wilson, but purely by the fact that I could not endure that such a woman should be Mrs. Huntingdon's sister, and that, as well for his own sake as for hers, I could not bear to think of his being deceived into a union with one so unworthy of him, and so utterly unfitted to be the partner of his quiet home and the companion of his life. He had had uncomfortable suspicions on that head himself, I imagined, but such was his inexperience, and such were the lady's powers of attraction, and her skill in bringing them to bear upon his young imagination, that they had not disturbed him long, and I believe the only effectual causes of the vacillating indecision that had preserved him hitherto from making an actual declaration of love, was the consideration of her connections, and especially of her mother, whom he could not abide. Had they lived at a distance, he might have surmounted the objection, but within 2 or 3 miles of Woodford it was really no light matter. "You've been to call on the Wilsons, Lawrence?" said I, as I walked beside his pony.
"Yes,"
replied he, slightly averting his face.
"I thought it but civil to take the first opportunity of returning their kind attentions, since they have been so very particular and constant in their inquiries throughout the whole course of my illness."
"It's all Miss Wilson's doing,"
"And if it is,"
returned he, with a very perceptible blush,
"is that any reason why I should not make a suitable acknowledgment?"
"it is a reason why you should not make the acknowledgment she looks for,"
"Let us drop that subject, if you please,"
said he, in evident displeasure. "No, Lawrence, with your leave we'll continue it a while longer, and I'll tell you something now or about it, which you may believe or not, as you choose. Only please to remember that it is not my custom to speak falsely, and that in this case I can have no motive for misrepresenting the truth."
"Well, Markham, what now?"
"Miss Wilson hates your sister. It may be natural enough that, in her ignorance of the relationship, she should feel some degree of enmity against her, but no good or amiable woman would be capable of evincing that bitter, cold-blooded, designing malice towards a fancied rival that I have observed in her."
"Markham!"
"Yes, and it is my belief that Eliza Millward and she, if not the very originators of the slanderous reports that have been propagated, were designedly the encouragers and chief disseminators of them. She was not desirous to mix up your name in the matter, of course, but her delight was, and still is, to blacken your sister's character to the utmost of her power, without risking too greatly the exposure of her own malevolence."
"I cannot believe it,"
interrupted my companion, his face burning with indignation. "Well, as I cannot prove it, I must content myself with asserting that it is so, to the best of my belief. But as you would not willingly marry Miss Wilson, if it were so, you will do well to be cautious, till you have proved it to be otherwise."
"I never told you, Markham, that I intended to marry Miss Wilson,"
said he proudly. "No, but whether you do or not, she intends to marry you."
"Did she tell you so?"
"No, but—"
"Then you have no right to make such an assertion respecting her."
He slightly quickened his pony's pace, but I laid my hand on its mane, determined he should not leave me yet. "Wait a moment, Lawrence, and let me explain myself, and don't be so very, I don't know what to call it, inaccessible as you are. I know what you think of Jane Wilson, and I believe I know how far you are mistaken in your opinion. You think she is singularly charming, elegant, sensible, and refined. You are not aware that she is selfish, cold-hearted, ambitious, artful, shallow-minded—"
"Enough, Markham, enough."
"No, let me finish. You don't know that, if you married her, your home would be rayless and comfortless, and it would break your heart at last to find yourself united to one so wholly incapable of sharing your tastes, feelings, and ideas, so utterly destitute of sensibility, good feeling, and true nobility of soul."
"Have you done?"
asked my companion quietly. "Yes, I know you hate me for my impertinence, but I don't care, if it only conduces to preserve you from that fatal mistake."
"Well,"
returned he, with a rather wintry smile,
"I'm glad you have overcome or forgotten your own afflictions so far as to be able to study so deeply the affairs of others, and trouble your head so unnecessarily about the fancied or possible calamities of their future life."
We parted, somewhat coldly again, but still we did not cease to be friends, and my well-meant warning, though it might have been more judiciously delivered, as well as more thankfully received, was not wholly unproductive of the desired effect. His visit to the Wilsons was not repeated, and though, in our subsequent interviews, he never mentioned her name to me, nor I to him, I have reason to believe he pondered my words in his mind, eagerly though covertly sought information respecting the fair lady from other quarters, secretly compared my character of her with what he had himself observed and what he heard from others, and finally came to the conclusion that, all things considered, she had much better remain Miss Wilson of Rycote Farm than be transmuted into Mrs. Lawrence of Woodford Hall. I believe, too, that he soon learned to contemplate with secret amazement his former predilection, and to congratulate himself on the lucky escape he had made. But he never confessed it to me, or hinted one word of acknowledgment for the part I had had in his deliverance. But this was not surprising to anyone that knew him as I did. As for Jane Wilson, she of course was disappointed and embittered by the sudden cold neglect and ultimate desertion of a former admirer. Had I done wrong to blight her cherished hopes? I think not, and certainly my conscience has never accused me, from that day to this, of any evil design in the matter.
End of chapter 46. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
One morning, about the beginning of November, while I was inditing some business letters, shortly after breakfast, Eliza Millward came to call upon my sister. Rose had neither the discrimination nor the virulence to regard the little demon as I did, and they still preserved their former intimacy. At the moment of her arrival, however, there was no one in the room but Fergus and myself, my mother and sister being both of them absent, on household cares intent. But I was not going to lay myself out for her amusement, whoever else might so incline. I merely honoured her with a careless salutation and a few words of course, and then went on with my writing, leaving my brother to be more polite if he chose. But you wanted to tease me.
What a pleasure it is to find you at home, Mr. Markham,
said she, with a disingenuously malicious smile.
I so seldom see you now, for you never come to the vicarage. Papa is quite offended, I can tell you,
she added playfully, looking into my face with an impertinent laugh, as she seated herself half beside and half before my desk, off the corner of the table. I have had a good deal to do of late, said I, without looking up from my letter.
Have you indeed? Somebody said you had been strangely neglecting your business these last few months.
Somebody said wrong. For these last 2 months, especially, I have been particularly plodding and diligent.
Ah, well, there's nothing like active employment, I suppose, to console the afflicted. And excuse me, Mr. Markham, but you look so very far from well, and have been by all accounts so moody and thoughtful of late, I could almost think you have some secret care preying on your spirits. Formerly,
said she timidly,
I could have ventured to ask you what it was, and what I could do to comfort you. I dare not do it now.
You are very kind, Miss Eliza. When I think you can do anything to comfort me, I'll make bold to tell you.
Pray do. I suppose I mayn't guess what it is that troubles you.
There's no necessity, for I'll tell you plainly. The thing that troubles me the most at present is a young lady sitting at my elbow and preventing me from finishing my letter, and thereafter repairing to my daily business. Before she could reply to this ungallant speech, Rose entered the room, and Miss Eliza rising to greet her, they both seated themselves near the fire, where that idle lad Fergus was standing, leaning his shoulder against the corner of the chimney-piece, with his legs crossed and his hands in his breeches pockets.
Now, Rose, I'll tell you a piece of news. I hope you have not heard it before, for good, bad, or indifferent, one always likes to be the first to tell. It's about that sad Mrs. Graham.
Hush!
Whispered Fergus, in a tone of solemn import.
We never mention her. Her name is never heard.
And glancing up, I caught him with his eye askance on me, and his finger pointed to his forehead. Then winking at the young lady, with a doleful shake of the head, he whispered,
A monomania, but don't mention it. All right, but that.
I should be sorry to injure anyone's feelings,
returned she, speaking below her breath.
Another time, perhaps.
Speak out, Miss Eliza, said I, not deigning to notice the other's buffooneries. You needn't fear to say anything in my presence.
Well,
answered she,
Perhaps you know already that Mrs. Graham's husband is not really dead, and that she had run away from him."
I started, and felt my face glow, but I bent it over my letter, and went on folding it up as she proceeded.
"But perhaps you did not know that she is now gone back to him again, and that a perfect reconciliation has taken place between them. Only think,"
she continued, turning to the confounded Rose.
"what a fool the man must be!"
"And who gave you this piece of intelligence, Miss Eliza?" said I, interrupting my sister's exclamations.
"I had it from a very authentic source."
"From whom, may I ask?"
"From one of the servants at Woodford."
"Oh, I was not aware that you were on such intimate terms with Mr. Lawrence's household."
"It was not from the man himself that I heard it, but he told it in confidence to our maid Sarah, and Sarah told it to me."
"In confidence, I suppose, and you tell it in confidence to us. But I can tell you that it is but a lame story after all, and scarcely one half of it true." While I spoke, I completed the sealing and direction of my letters, with a somewhat unsteady hand, in spite of all my efforts to retain composure, and in spite of my firm conviction that the story was a lame one, that the supposed Mrs. Graham most certainly had not voluntarily gone back to her husband, or dreamt of a reconciliation. Most likely she was gone away, and the tale-bearing servant, not knowing what was become of her, had conjectured that such was the case, and our fair visitor had detailed it as a certainty, delighted with such an opportunity of tormenting me. But it was possible, barely possible, that someone might have betrayed her, and she had been taken away by force. Determined to know the worst, I hastily pocketed my 2 letters, and muttered something about being too late for the post, left the room, rushed into the yard, and vociferously called for my horse. No one being there, I dragged him out of the stable myself, strapped the saddle onto his back and the bridle onto his head, mounted, and speedily galloped away to Woodford. I found its owner pensively strolling in the grounds. "Is your sister gone?" were my first words as I grasped his hand, instead of the usual inquiry after his health.
"Yes, she's gone,"
was his answer, so calmly spoken that my terror was at once removed. "I suppose I mayn't know where she is," said I, as I dismounted, and relinquished my horse to the gardener, who, being the only servant within call, had been summoned by his master, from his employment of raking up the dead leaves on the lawn, to take him to the stables. My companion gravely took my arm, and leading me away to the garden, thus answered my question.
"She is at Grassdale Manor, in shire."
"Where?" cried I, with a convulsive start.
"At Grassdale Manor."
"How was it?" I gasped. "Who betrayed her?"
"She went of her own accord."
"Impossible, Lawrence! She could not be so frantic!" exclaimed I, vehemently grasping his arm, as if to force him to unsay those hateful words.
"She did,"
persisted he, in the same grave, collected manner as before.
"and not without reason,"
he continued, gently disengaging himself from my grasp.
"Mr. Huntington is ill."
"And so she went to nurse him?"
"Yes."
"Fool!" I could not help exclaiming, and Lawrence looked up with a rather reproachful glance. "Is he dying, then?"
"I think not, Markham."
"And how many more nurses has he? How many ladies are there besides to take care of him?"
"None. He was alone, or she would not have gone."
"Oh, confound it! This is intolerable."
"What is, that he should be alone?"
I attempted no reply, for I was not sure that this circumstance did not partly conduce to my distraction. I therefore continued to pace the walk in silent anguish, with my hand pressed to my forehead. Then suddenly pausing, and turning to my companion, I impatiently exclaimed, "Why did she take this infatuated step? What fiend persuaded her to it?"
"Nothing persuaded her but her own sense of duty."
"Humbug!"
"I was half inclined to say so myself, Markham, at first. I assure you it was not by my advice that she went, for I detest that man as fervently as you can do, except indeed that his reformation would give me much greater pleasure than his death, but all I did was to inform her of the circumstance of his illness, the consequence of a fall from his horse in hunting, and to tell her that that unhappy person, Miss Myers, had left him some time ago.
It was ill done. Now when he finds the convenience of her presence, he will make all manner of lying speeches and false fair promises for the future, and she will believe him, and then her condition will be 10 times worse, and 10 times more irremediable than before.
There does not appear to be much ground for such apprehensions at present,
said he, producing a letter from his pocket.
From the account I received this morning, I should say.
It was her writing. By an irresistible impulse I held out my hand, and the words, "Let me see it," involuntarily passed my lips. He was evidently reluctant to grant the request, but while he hesitated I snatched it from his hand. Recollecting myself, however, the minute after, I offered to restore it. "Here, take it," said I, "if you don't want me to read it."
No,
replied he.
You may read it if you like.
I read it, and so may you.
Grassdale, November 4th. Dear Frederick, I know you will be anxious to hear from me, and I will tell you all I can. Mr. Huntingdon is very ill, but not dying, or in any immediate danger, and he is rather better at present than he was when I came. I found the house in sad confusion. Mrs. Greaves, Benson, every decent servant had left, and those that were come to supply their places were a negligent, disorderly set, to say no worse. I must change them again, if I stay. A professional nurse, a grim, hard old woman, had been hired to attend the wretched invalid. He suffers much, and has no fortitude to bear him through. The immediate injuries he sustained from the accident, however, were not very severe, and would, as the doctor says, have been but trifling to a man of temperate habits, but with him it is very different. On the night of my arrival, when I first entered his room, he was lying in a kind of half delirium. He did not notice me till I spoke, and then he mistook me for another.
"Is it you, Alice, come again?"
he murmured.
"What did you leave me for?"
"It is I, Arthur. It is Helen, your wife," I replied.
"My wife?"
he said with a start.
"For heaven's sake, don't mention her. I have none. Devil take her!"
he cried, a moment after.
"And you too. What did you do it for?"
I said no more, but observing that he kept gazing towards the foot of the bed, I went and sat there, placing the light so as to shine full upon me, for I thought he might be dying, and I wanted him to know me. For a long time he lay silently looking upon me, first with a vacant stare, then with a fixed gaze of strange growing intensity. At last he startled me by suddenly raising himself on his elbow, and demanding in a horrified whisper, with his eyes still fixed upon me,
"Who is it?"
"It is Helen Huntingdon," said I, quietly rising at the same time, and removing to a less conspicuous position.
"I must be going mad,"
cried he.
"or something. Delirious, perhaps. But leave me, whoever you are. I can't bear that white face and those eyes. For God's sakes, go! And send me somebody else that doesn't look like that."
I went at once, and sent the hired nurse. But next morning I ventured to enter his chamber again, and taking the nurse's place by his bedside, I watched him and waited on him for several hours, showing myself as little as possible, and only speaking when necessary, and then not above my breath. At first he addressed me as the nurse, but on my crossing the room to draw up the window blinds, in obedience to his directions, he said,
"No, it isn't nurse. It's Alice. Stay with me, do. That old hag'll be the death of me."
"I mean to stay with you," said I, and after that he would call me Alice, or some other name almost equally repugnant to my feelings. I forced myself to endure it for a while, fearing a contradiction might disturb him too much, but when, having asked for a glass of water, while I held it to his lips, he murmured,
"Thanks, dearest,"
I could not help distinctly observing, "You would not say so if you knew me," intending to follow that up with another declaration of my identity, but he merely muttered an incoherent reply, so I dropped it again, till some time after, when, as I was bathing his forehead and temples with vinegar and water to relieve the heat and pain in his head, he observed, after looking earnestly upon me for some minutes,
"I have such strange fancies. I can't get rid of them, and they won't let me rest, and the most singular and pertinacious of them all is your face and voice. They seem just like hers. I could swear at this moment that she was by my side."
"She is," said I.
"That seems comfortable."
continued he, without noticing my words.
And while you do it, the other fancies fade away. But this only strengthens. Go on till it vanishes too. I can't stand such a mania as this. It would kill me.
It will never vanish, said I distinctly, for it is the truth.
The truth?
He cried, starting, as if an asp had stung him.
You don't mean to say that you are really she?
I do, but you needn't shrink away from me, as if I were your greatest enemy. I am come to take care of you, and do what none of them would do.
For God's sake, don't torment me now,
cried he, in pitiable agitation, and then he began to mutter bitter curses against me, or the evil fortune that had brought me there, while I put down the sponge and basin and resumed my seat at the bedside.
Where are they?
Said he.
Have they all left me? Servants and all?
There are servants within call if you want them, but you had better lie down now and be quiet. None of them could or would attend you as carefully as I shall do.
I can't understand it at all,
said he, in bewildered perplexity.
Was it a dream that—
And he covered his eyes with his hands, as if trying to unravel the mystery. No, Arthur, it was not a dream. That your conduct was such as to oblige me to leave you. But I heard that you were ill and alone, and I am come back to nurse you. You need not fear to trust me. Tell me all your wants, and I will try to satisfy them. There is no one else to care for you, and I shall not upbraid you now.
Oh, I see,
said he, with a bitter smile.
It's an act of Christian charity, whereby you hope to gain a higher seat in heaven for yourself, and scoop a deeper pit in hell for me.
No, I came to offer you that comfort and assistance your situation required. And if I could benefit your soul as well as your body, and awaken some sense of contrition and—
Oh, yes, if you could overwhelm me with remorse and confusion of face. Now's the time. What have you done with my son?
He is well, and you may see him sometime, if you will compose yourself, but not now.
Where is he?
He is safe.
Is he here?
Wherever he is, you will not see him till you have promised to leave him entirely under my care and protection, and to let me take him away whenever and wherever I please, if I should hereafter judge it necessary to remove him again. But we will talk of that tomorrow. You must be quiet now.
No, let me see him now. I promise, if it must be so.
No.
I swear it, as God is in heaven. Now then, let me see him.
But I cannot trust your oaths and promises. I must have a written agreement, and you must sign it in presence of a witness. But not today. Tomorrow.
No, today, now,
persisted he, and he was in such a state of feverish excitement, and so bent upon the immediate gratification of his wish, that I thought it better to grant it at once, as I saw he would not rest till I did. But I was determined my son's interest should not be forgotten, and having clearly written out the promise I wished Mr. Huntingdon to give, upon a slip of paper, I deliberately read it over to him, and made him sign it in the presence of Rachel. He begged I would not insist upon this. It was a useless exposure of my want of faith in his word to the servant. I told him I was sorry, but since he had forfeited my confidence, he must take the consequence. He next pleaded inability to hold the pen. Then we must wait until you can hold it, said I. Upon which he said he would try, but then he could not see to write. I placed my finger where the signature was to be, and told him he might write his name in the dark, if he only knew where to put it. But he had not power to form the letters. In that case you must be too ill to see the child, said I, and finding me inexorable, he at length managed to ratify the agreement, and I bade Rachel send the boy. All this may strike you as harsh, but I felt I must not lose my present advantage, and my son's future welfare should not be sacrificed to any mistaken tenderness for this man's feelings. Little Arthur had not forgotten his father, but 13 months of absence, during which he had seldom been permitted to hear a word about him, or hardly to whisper his name, had rendered him somewhat shy, and when he was ushered into the darkened room where the sick man lay, so altered from his former self, with fiercely flushed face and wildly gleaming eyes, he instinctively clung to me, and stood looking on his father with a countenance expressive of far more awe than pleasure.
Come here, Arthur,
said the latter, extending his hand towards him. The child went, and timidly touched that burning hand, but almost started in alarm when his father suddenly clutched his arm and drew him nearer to his side.
Do you know me?
asked Mr. Huntingdon, intently perusing his features.
Yes.
Who am I?
Papa.
Are you glad to see me?
Yes.
You're not,
replied the disappointed parent, relaxing his hold and darting a vindictive glance at me. Arthur, thus released, crept back to me and put his hand in mine. His father swore I had made the child hate him, and abused and cursed me bitterly. The instant he began I sent our son out of the room, and when he paused to breathe, I calmly assured him that he was entirely mistaken. I had never once attempted to prejudice his child against him. I did indeed desire him to forget you, I said, and especially to forget the lessons you taught him, and for that cause, and to lessen the danger of discovery, I own I have generally discouraged his inclination to talk about you, but no one can blame me for that, I think. The invalid only replied by groaning aloud, and rolling his head on a pillow in a paroxysm of impatience.
I'm in hell already,
cried he.
This cursed thirst is burning my heart to ashes. Will nobody—
Before he could finish the sentence, I had poured out a glass of some acidulated cooling drink that was on the table, and brought it to him. He drank it greedily, but muttered as I took away the glass.
I suppose you're heaping coals of fire on my head, you think?
Not noticing this speech, I asked if there was anything else I could do for him.
Yes. I'll give you another opportunity of showing your Christian magnanimity,
sneered he.
Set my pillow straight, and these confounded bedcloths.
I did so.
There. Now get me another glass of that slop.
I complied.
This is delightful, isn't it?
Said he, with a malicious grin as I held it to his lips.
You never hoped for such a glorious opportunity.
Now, shall I stay with you? Said I, as I replaced the glass on the table. Or will you be more quiet if I go and send the nurse?
Oh, yes. You're wondrous gentle and obliging. But you've driven me mad with it all,
responded he, with an impatient toss. I'll leave you then, said I, and I withdrew, and did not trouble him with my presence again that day, except for a minute or two at a time, just to see how he was and what he wanted. Next morning the doctor ordered him to be bled, and after that he was more subdued and tranquil. I passed half the day in his room at different intervals. My presence did not appear to agitate or irritate him as before, and he accepted my services quietly, without any bitter remarks. Indeed, he scarcely spoke at all, except to make known his wants, and hardly then. But on the morrow, that is to say, in proportion as he recovered from the state of exhaustion and stupefaction, his ill nature appeared to revive.
Oh, this sweet revenge!
Cried he, when I had been doing all I could to make him comfortable, and to remedy the carelessness of his nurse.
And you can enjoy it with such a quiet conscience, too, because it's all in the way of duty.
It is well for me that I am doing my duty, said I, with a bitterness I could not repress, for it is the only comfort I have, and the satisfaction of my own conscience, it seems, is the only reward I need look for. He looked rather surprised at the earnestness of my manner.
What reward did you look for?
He asked. You will think me a liar if I tell you, but I did hope to benefit you, as well to better your mind, as to alleviate your present sufferings. But it appears I am to do neither. Your own bad spirit will not let me. As far as you are concerned, I have sacrificed my own feelings, and all the little earthly comfort that was left me, to no purpose, and every little thing I do for you is ascribed to self-righteous malice and refined revenge.
It's all very fine, I dare say,
said he, eyeing me with stupid amazement.
And of course I ought to be melted to tears of penitence and admiration at the sight of so much generosity and superhuman goodness. But you see I can't manage it. However, pray, do me all the good you can if you do really find any pleasure in it, for you perceive I am almost as miserable just now as you need wish to see me. Since you came, I confess I have had better attendance than before, for these wretches neglected me shamefully, and all my old friends seem to have fairly forsaken me. I've had a dreadful time of it, I assure you. I sometimes thought I should have died. Do you think there's any chance?
There's always a chance of death, and it is always well to live with such a chance in view.
Yes, yes, but do you think there's any likelihood that this illness will have a fatal termination?
I cannot tell. But, supposing it should, how are you prepared to meet the event?
Why, the doctor told me I wasn't to think about it, for I was sure to get better if I stuck to his regimen and prescriptions.
I hope you may, Arthur, but neither the doctor nor I can speak with certainty in such a case. There is internal injury, and it is difficult to know to what extent.
Then you want to scare me to death?
No, but I don't want to lull you to false security. If a consciousness of the uncertainty of life can dispose you to serious and useful thoughts, I would not deprive you of the benefit of such reflections. Whether you do eventually recover or not, does the idea of death appall you very much?
It's just the only thing I can't bear to think of. So if you've any—
But it must come some time, interrupted I, and if it be years hence, it will as certainly overtake you as if it came to-day, and no doubt be as unwelcome then as now, unless you—
Oh, hang it! Don't torment me with your preachments now, unless you want to kill me outright. I can't stand it, I tell you. I've sufferings enough without that. If you think there's danger, save me from it, and then, in gratitude, I'll hear whatever you like to say.
I accordingly dropped the unwelcome topic. And now, Frederick, I think I may bring my letter to a close. From these details you may form your own judgment of the state of my patient, and of my own position and future prospects. Let me hear from you soon, and I will write again to tell you how we get on. But now that my presence is tolerated, and even required, in the sick-room, I shall have but little time to spare between my husband and my son, for I must not entirely neglect the latter. It would not do to keep him always with Rachel, and I dare not leave him for a moment with any of the other servants, or suffer him to be alone, lest he should meet them. If his father get worse, I shall ask Esther Hargrave to take charge of him for a time, till I have reorganized the household at least, but I greatly prefer keeping him under my own eye. I find myself in rather a singular position. I am exerting my utmost endeavours to promote the recovery and reformation of my husband, and if I succeed, what shall I do? My duty, of course, but how? No matter. I can perform the task that is before me now, and God will give me strength to do whatever he requires hereafter. Good-bye, dear Frederick. Helen Huntingdon.
What do you think of it?
Said Lawrence, as I silently refolded the letter. It seems to me, returned I, that she is casting her pearls before swine. May they be satisfied with trampling them under their feet, and not turn again and rend her. But I shall say no more against her. I see that she was actuated by the best and noblest motives in what she has done, and if the act is not a wise one, may heaven protect her from its consequences. May I keep this letter, Lawrence? You see, she has never once mentioned me throughout, or made the most distant allusion to me. Therefore there can be no impropriety or harm in it.
And therefore why should you wish to keep it?
Were not these characters written by her hand, and were not these words conceived in her mind, and many of them spoken by her lips?
Well,
said he, and so I kept it. Otherwise, Halford, you could never have become so thoroughly acquainted with its contents. And when you write, said I, will you have the goodness to ask her if I may be permitted to enlighten my mother and sister on her real history and circumstance, just so far as is necessary to make the neighbourhood sensible of the shameful injustice they have done her? I want no tender messages, but just ask her that, and tell her it is the greatest favour she could do me, and tell her— no, nothing more. You see, I know the address, and I might write to her myself, but I am so virtuous as to refrain.
Well, I'll do this for you, Markham.
And as soon as you receive an answer, you let me know.
If all be well, I'll come myself and tell you immediately.
End of chapter 47. Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
5 or 6 days after this, Mr. Lawrence paid us the honour of a call, and when he and I were alone together, which I contrived as soon as possible, by bringing him out to look at my corn stacks, he showed me another letter from his sister. This one he was quite willing to submit to my longing gaze. He thought, I suppose, it would do me good. The only answer it gave to my message was this:
Mr. Markham is at liberty to make such revelations concerning me as he judges necessary. He will know that I should wish but little to be said on the subject. I hope he is well, but tell him he must not think of me.
I can give you a few extracts from the rest of the letter, for I was permitted to keep this also, perhaps as an antidote to all pernicious hopes and fancies.
He is decidedly better, but very low from the depressing effects of his severe illness, and the strict regimen he is obliged to observe, so opposite to all his previous habits. It is deplorable to see how completely his past life has degenerated his once noble constitution, and vitiated the whole system of his organization. But the doctor says he may now be considered out of danger, if he will only continue to observe the necessary restrictions. Some stimulating cordials he must have, but they should be judiciously diluted and sparingly used, and I find it very difficult to keep him to this. At first, his extreme dread of death rendered the task an easy one, but in proportion as he feels his acute suffering abating, and sees the danger receding, the more intractable he becomes. Now, also, his appetite for food is beginning to return, and here, too, his long habits of self-indulgence are greatly against him. I watch and restrain him as well as I can, and often get bitterly abused for my rigid severity, and sometimes he contrives to elude my vigilance, and sometimes acts in opposition to my will. But he is now so completely reconciled to my attendance in general, that he is never satisfied when I am not by his side. I am obliged to be a little stiff with him sometimes, or he would make a complete slave of me, and I know it would be unpardonable weakness to give up all other interests for him. I have the servants to overlook, and my little Arthur to attend to, and my own health too, all of which would be entirely neglected were I to satisfy his exorbitant demands. I do not generally sit up at night, for I think the nurse who has made it her business is better qualified for such undertakings than I am. But still, an unbroken night's rest is what I but seldom enjoy, and never can venture to reckon upon, for my patient makes no scruple of calling me up at an hour when his wants or his fancies require my presence. But he is manifestly afraid of my displeasure, and if at one time he tries my patience by his unreasonable exactions, and fretful complaints and reproaches, at another he depresses me by his abject submission and deprecatory self-abasement, when he fears he's gone too far. But all this I can readily pardon. I know it is chiefly the result of his enfeebled frame and disordered nerves. What annoys me the most is his occasional attempts at affectionate fondness that I can neither credit nor return. Not that I hate him. His sufferings and my own laborious care have given him some claim to my regard, to my affection even, if he would only be quiet and sincere, and content to let things remain as they are. But the more he tries to conciliate me, the more I shrink from him, and from the future.
Helen, what do you mean to do when I get well?
He asked this morning.
Will you run away again?
It entirely depends upon your own conduct.
Oh, I'll be very good.
But if I find it necessary to leave you, Arthur, I shall not run away. You know I have your own promise that I may go whenever I please, and take my son with me.
Oh, but you shall have no cause.
And then followed a variety of professions, which I rather coldly checked.
Will you not forgive me then?
Said he. Yes, I have forgiven you, but I know you cannot love me as you once did, and I should be very sorry if you were to, for I could not pretend to return it. So let us drop the subject, and never recur to it again. But what I have done for you, you may judge of what I will do, if it be not incompatible with the higher duty I owe to my son. Higher, because he never forfeited his claims, and because I hope to do more good to him than I can ever do to you. And if you wish me to feel kindly towards you, it is deeds, not words, which must purchase my affection and esteem. His sole reply to this was a slight grimace, and a scarcely perceptible shrug. Alas, unhappy man! Words with him are so much cheaper than deeds. It was as if I had said, pounds, not pence, must buy the article you want. And then he sighed a querulous, self-commiserating sigh, as if in pure regret that he, the loved and courted of so many worshippers, should be now abandoned to the mercy of a harsh, exacting, cold-hearted woman like that, and even glad of what kindness she chose to bestow. It's a pity, isn't it? Said I, and whether I rightly divined his musings or not, the observation chimed in with his thoughts, for he answered,
It can't be helped,
with a rueful smile at my penetration. I have seen Esther Hargrave twice. She's a charming creature, but her blithe spirit is almost broken, and her sweet temper almost spoiled, by the still unremitting persecutions of her mother, in behalf of her rejected suitor. Not violent, but wearisome and unremitting, like a continual dropping. The unnatural parent seems determined to make her daughter's life a burden, if she will not yield to her desires.
Mamma does all she can,
said she,
to make me feel myself a burden and encumbrance to the family, and the most ungrateful, selfish, and undutiful daughter that ever was born. And Walter, too, is as stern and cold and haughty as if he hated me outright. I believe I should have yielded at once if I had known from the beginning how much resistance would have cost me, but now, for very obstinacy's sake, I will stand out.
A bad motive for a good resolve, I answered. But, however, I know you have better motives really, for your perseverance, and I counsel you to keep them still in view.
Trust me, I will. I threaten mamma sometimes that I'll run away and disgrace the family by earning my own livelihood if she torments me any more, and then that frightens her a little. But I will do it in good earnest if they don't mind.
Be quiet and patient a while, said I, and better times will come. Poor girl! I wish somebody that was worthy to possess her would come and take her away. Don't you, Frederick?
If the perusal of this letter filled me with dismay for Helen's future life and mine, there was one great source of consolation. It was now in my power to clear her name from every foul aspersion. The Millwards and Wilsons should see with their own eyes the bright sun bursting from the cloud, and they should be scorched and dazzled by its beams. And my own friends too should see it, they whose suspicions had been such gall and wormwood to my soul. To effect this, I had only to drop the seed into the ground, and it would soon become a stately branching herb. A few words to my mother and sister, I knew, would suffice to spread the news throughout the whole neighbourhood, without any further exertion on my part. Rose was delighted, and as soon as I had told her all I thought proper, which was all I affected to know, she flew with alacrity to put on her bonnet and shawl, and hastened to carry the glad tidings to the Millwards and Wilsons. Glad tidings, I suspect, to none but herself and Mary Millward, that steady, sensible girl, whose sterling worth had been so quickly perceived and duly valued by the supposed Mrs. Graham, in spite of her plain outside, and who on her part had been better able to see and appreciate that lady's true character and qualities than the brightest genius among them. As I may never have occasion to mention her again, I may as well tell you here that she was at this time privately engaged to Richard Wilson, a secret, I believe, to everyone but themselves. That worthy student was now at Cambridge, where his most exemplary conduct and his diligent perseverance in the pursuit of learning carried him safely through, and eventually brought him, with hard-earned honours and an untarnished reputation, to the close of his collegiate career. In due time he became Mr. Millward's first and only curate, for that gentleman's declining years forced him at last to acknowledge that the duties of his extensive parish were a little too much for those vaunted energies which he was wont to boast over his younger and less active brethren of the cloth. This was what the patient, faithful lovers had privately planned and quietly waited for years ago, and in due time they were united, to the astonishment of the little world they lived in, that had long since declared them both born to single blessedness, affirming it impossible that the pale, retiring bookworm should ever summon courage to seek a wife, or be able to obtain one if he did, and equally impossible that the plain-looking, plain-dealing, unattractive, unconciliating Miss Millward should ever find a husband. They still continued to live at the vicarage, the lady dividing her time between her father, her husband, and their poor parishioners, and subsequently her rising family. And now that the Reverend Michael Millward has been gathered to his fathers, full of years and honours, the Reverend Richard Wilson has succeeded him to the vicarage of Linden Hope, greatly to the satisfaction of its inhabitants, who had so long tried and fully proved his merits, and those of his excellent and well-loved partner. If you are interested in the after-fate of that lady's sister, I can only tell you, what perhaps you have heard from another quarter, that some 12 or 13 years ago she relieved the happy couple of her presence by marrying a wealthy tradesman of L, and I don't envy him his bargain. I fear she leads him a rather uncomfortable life, though happily he is too dull to perceive the extent of his misfortune. I have little enough to do with her myself. We have not met for many years, but I am well assured she has not yet forgotten or forgiven either her former lover or the lady whose superior qualities first opened his eyes to the folly of his boyish attachment. As for Richard Wilson's sister, she, having been wholly unable to recapture Mr. Lawrence, or obtain any partner rich and elegant enough to suit her ideas of what the husband of Jane Wilson ought to be, is yet in single blessedness. Shortly after the death of her mother, she withdrew the light of her presence from Rycote Farm, finding it impossible any longer to endure the rough manners and unsophisticated habits of her honest brother Robert and his worthy wife, or the idea of being identified with such vulgar people in the eyes of the world, and took lodgings in the county town, where she lived, and still lives, I suppose, in a kind of close-fisted, cold, uncomfortable gentility, doing no good to others, and but little to herself, spending her days in fancy work and scandal, referring frequently to her brother the vicar and her sister the vicar's lady, but never to her brother the farmer and her sister the farmer's wife, seeing as much company as she can without too much expense, but loving no one and beloved by none, a cold-hearted, supercilious, keenly, insidiously censorious old maid.
End of chapter 48. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Though Mr. Lawrence's health was now quite re-established, my visits to Woodford were as unremitting as ever, though often less protracted than before. We seldom talked about Mrs. Huntingdon, but yet we never met without mentioning her, for I never sought his company but with the hope of hearing something about her, and he never sought mine at all, because he saw me often enough without. But I always began to talk of other things, and waited first to see if he would introduce the subject. If he did not, I would casually ask, "Have you heard from your sister lately?" If he said,
No.
the matter was dropped. If he said,
Yes.
I would venture to inquire, "How is she?" but never, "How is her husband?" though I might be burning to know, because I had not the hypocrisy to profess any anxiety for his recovery, and I had not the face to express any desire for a contrary result. Had I any such desire? I fear I must plead guilty. But since you have heard my confession, you must hear my justification as well, a few of the excuses, at least, wherewith I sought to pacify my own accusing conscience. In the first place, you see, his life did harm to others, and evidently no good to himself, and, though I wished it to terminate, I would not have hastened its close if, by the lifting of a finger, I could have done so, or if a spirit had whispered in my ear that a single effort of the will would be enough, unless, indeed, I had the power to exchange him for some other victim of the grave, whose life might be of service to his race, and whose death would be lamented by his friends. But was there any harm in wishing that, among the many thousands whose souls would certainly be required of them before the year was over, this wretched mortal might be one? I thought not, and therefore I wished with all my heart that it might please heaven to remove him to a better world, or if that might not be, still to take him out of this. For if he were unfit to answer the summons now, after a warning sickness, and with such an angel by his side, it seemed but too certain that he never would be, that, on the contrary, returning health would bring returning lust and villainy. And as he grew more certain of recovery, more accustomed to her generous goodness, his feelings would become more callous, his heart more flinty and impervious to her persuasive arguments. But God knew best. Meantime, however, I could not but be anxious for the result of his decrees, knowing as I did that, leaving myself entirely out of the question, however Helen might feel interested in her husband's welfare, however she might deplore his fate, still while he lived she must be miserable. A fortnight passed away, and my inquiries were always answered in the negative. At length the welcome
Yes.
drew from me the second question. Lawrence divined my anxious thoughts, and appreciated my reserve. I feared at first he was going to torture me by unsatisfactory replies, and either leave me quite in the dark concerning what I wanted to know, or force me to drag the information out of him, morsel by direct inquiries, And serve you right, you will say. But he was more merciful, and in a little while he put his sister's letter into my hand. I silently read it, and restored it to him without comment or remark. This mode of procedure suited him so well that thereafter he always pursued the plan of showing me her letters at once, when inquired after her, if there were any to show. It was so much less trouble than to tell me their contents, and I received such confidences so quietly and discreetly that he was never induced to discontinue them. But I devoured those precious letters with my eyes, and never let them go till their contents were stamped upon my mind. And when I got home, the most important passages were entered in my diary among the remarkable events of the day. The first of these communications brought intelligence of a serious relapse in Mr. Huntingdon's illness, entirely the result of his own infatuation in persisting in the indulgence of his appetite for stimulating drink. In vain had she remonstrated, in vain she had mingled his wine with water. Her arguments and entreaties were a nuisance. Her interference was an insult so intolerable that at length, on finding she had covertly diluted the pale port that was brought him, he threw the bottle out of the window, swearing he would not be cheated like a baby, ordered the butler, on pain of instant dismissal, to bring a bottle of the strongest wine in the cellar, and affirming that he should have been well long ago if he had been let to have his own way, but she wanted to keep him weak in order that she might have him under her thumb. But by the Lord Harry, he would have no more humbug, seized the glass in one hand and the bottle in the other, and never rested till he had drunk it dry. Alarming symptoms were the immediate result of this imprudence, as she mildly termed it, symptoms which had rather increased than diminished since, and this was the cause of her delay in writing to her brother. Every former feature of his malady had returned with augmented virulence. The slight external wound, half healed, had broken out afresh. Internal inflammation had taken place, which might terminate fatally if not soon removed. Of course the wretched sufferer's temper was not improved by this calamity. In fact, I suspect it was well nigh insupportable, though his kind nurse did not complain. But she said she had been obliged at last to give her son in charge to Esther Hargrave, as her presence was so constantly required in the sick-room that she could not possibly attend to him herself. And though the child had begged to be allowed to continue with her there, and to help her to nurse his papa, and though she had no doubt he would have been very good and quiet, she could not think of subjecting his young and tender feelings to the sight of so much suffering, or of allowing him to witness his father's impatience, or hear the dreadful language he was wont to use in his paroxysms of pain or irritation.
The latter,
continued she,
most deeply regrets the step that has occasioned his relapse, but as usual he throws the blame upon me. If I had reasoned with him like a rational creature, he says, it never would have happened. But to be treated like a baby or a fool was enough to put any man past his patience, and drive him to assert his independence, even at the sacrifice of his own interest. He forgets how often I had reasoned him past his patience before. He appears to be sensible of his danger, but nothing can induce him to behold it in the proper light. The other night, while I was waiting on him, and just as I had brought him a draught to assuage his burning thirst, he observed, with a return of his former sarcastic bitterness,
Yes, you're mighty attentive now. I suppose there's nothing you wouldn't do for me now.
You know, said I, a little surprised at his manner, that I am willing to do anything I can to relieve you.
Yes, now, my immaculate angel. But when once you have secured your reward, and find yourself safe in heaven, and me howling in hellfire, catch you lifting a finger to serve me then? No, you'll look complacently on, and not so much as dip the tip of your finger in water to cool my tongue.
If so, it will be because of the great gulf over which I cannot pass. And if I could look complacently on in such a case, it would be only from the assurance that you were being purified from your sins, and fitted to enjoy the happiness I felt. But are you determined, Arthur, that I shall not meet you in heaven?
What should I do there, I should like to know?
Indeed, I cannot tell, and I fear 'tis too certain that your tastes and feelings must be wildly altered before you can have enjoyment there. But do you prefer sinking, without an effort, into the state of torment you picture to yourself?"
"Oh, it's all a fable,"
said he, contemptuously. "Are you sure, Arthur? Are you quite sure? Because, if there is any doubt, and if you should find yourself mistaken after all, when it is too late to turn—"
"It would be rather awkward, to be sure,"
said he.
"but don't bother me now. I'm not going to die yet. I can't and won't,"
he added vehemently, as if suddenly struck with the appalling aspect of that terrible event.
"Helen, you must save me."
And he earnestly seized my hand, and looked into my face with such imploring eagerness that my heart bled for him, and I could not speak for tears.
The next letter brought intelligence that the malady was fast increasing, and the poor sufferer's horror of death was still more distressing than his impatience of bodily pain. All his friends had not forsaken him, for Mr. Hattersley, hearing of his danger, had come to see him from his distant home in the north. His wife had accompanied him, as much for the pleasure of seeing her dear friend, from whom she had been parted so long, as to visit her mother and sister. Mrs. Huntingdon expressed herself glad to see Millicent once more, and pleased to behold her so happy and well.
"She is now at the Grove,"
continued the letter,
"but she often calls to see me. Mr. Hattersley spends much of his time at Arthur's bedside. With more good feeling than I gave him credit for, he evinces considerable sympathy for his unhappy friend, and is far more willing than able to comfort him. Sometimes he tries to joke and laugh with him, but that will not do. Sometimes he endeavours to cheer him with talk about old times, and this at one time may serve to divert the sufferer from his own sad thoughts. At another, it will only plunge him into deeper melancholy than before, and then Hattersley is confounded, and knows not what to say, unless it be a timid suggestion that the clergyman might be sent for. But Arthur will never consent to that. He knows he has rejected the clergyman's well-meant admonitions with scoffing levity at other times, and cannot dream of turning to him for consolation now. Mr. Hattersley sometimes offers his services instead of mine, but Arthur will not let me go. That strange whim still increases, as his strength declines. The fancy to have me always by his side. I hardly ever leave him, except to go into the next room, where I sometimes snatch an hour or so of sleep when he is quiet, but even then the door is left ajar, that he may know me to be within call. I am with him now while I write, and I fear my occupation annoys him, though I frequently break off to attend to him, and though Mr. Hattersley is also by his side. That gentleman came, as he said, to beg a holiday for me, that I might have a run in the park, this fine frosty morning, with Millicent and Esther and little Arthur, whom he had driven over to see me. A poor invalid evidently felt it a heartless proposition, and would have felt it still more heartless in me to accede to it. I therefore said I would only go and speak to them a minute, and then come back. I did but exchange a few words with them, just outside the portico, inhaling the fresh bracing air as I stood, and then, resisting the earnest and eloquent entreaties of all three to stay a little longer, and join them in a walk round the garden, I tore myself away and returned to my patient. I had not been absent 5 minutes, but he reproached me bitterly for my levity and neglect. His friend espoused my cause.
"Nay, nay, Huntingdon,"
said he.
"you're too hard upon her. She must have food and sleep, and a mouthful of fresh air now and then, or she can't stand it, I tell you. Look at her, man. She's worn to a shadow already."
"What are her sufferings to mine?"
said the poor invalid.
"You don't grudge me these attentions, do you, Helen?"
"No, Arthur. If I could really serve you by them, I would give my life to save you, if I might."
"Would you indeed?" "No."
"Most willingly I would."
"Ah, that's because you think yourself more fit to die."
There was a painful pause. He was evidently plunged in gloomy reflections. But while I pondered for something to say that might benefit without alarming him, Hattersley, whose mind had been pursuing almost the same course, broke silence with,
"I say, Huntingdon, I would send for a parson of some sort. If you didn't like the vicar, you know, you could have his curate, or somebody else."
"No, none of them can benefit me if she can't,"
was the answer, and the tears gushed from his eyes as he earnestly exclaimed,
"Oh, Helen, if I had listened to you, it never would have come to this. And if I had heard you long ago, oh God, how different it would have been."
"Hear me now, then, Arthur," said I, gently pressing his hand.
"It's too late now,"
said he despondingly. And after that another paroxysm of pain came on, and then his mind began to wander, and we feared his death was approaching. But an opiate was administered, his sufferings began to abate, he gradually became more composed, and at length sank into a kind of slumber. He has been quieter since, and now Hattersley has left him, expressing a hope that he shall find him better when he calls to-morrow.
Perhaps I may recover,
he replied.
Who knows? This may have been the crisis. What do you think, Helen?
Unwilling to depress him, I gave the most cheering answer I could, but still recommended him to prepare for the possibility of what I inly feared was but too certain. But he was determined to hope. Shortly after he relapsed into a kind of doze, but now he groans again. There is a change. Suddenly he called me to his side, with such a strange, excited manner, that I feared he was delirious, but he was not.
That was the crisis, Helen,
said he delightedly.
I had an infernal pain here. It is quite gone now. I never was so easy since the fall. Quite gone, by heaven.
And he clasped and kissed my hand in the very fullness of his heart, but finding I did not participate in his joy, he quickly flung it from him, and bitterly cursed my coldness and insensibility. How could I reply? Kneeling beside him, I took his hand and fondly pressed it to my lips, for the first time since our separation, and told him, as well as tears would let me speak, that it was not that kept me silent. It was the fear that this sudden cessation of pain was not so favourable a symptom as he supposed. I immediately sent for the doctor. We are now anxiously awaiting him. I will tell you what he says. There is still the same freedom from pain, the same deadness to all sensation where the suffering was most acute. My worst fears are realized. Mortification has commenced. The doctor has told him there is no hope. No words can describe his anguish. I can write no more.
The next was still more distressing, in the tenor of its contents. The sufferer was fast approaching dissolution, dragged almost to the verge of that awful chasm he trembled to contemplate, from which no agony of prayers or tears could save him. Nothing could comfort him now. Hattersley's rough attempts at consolation were utterly in vain. The world was nothing to him. Life and all its interests, its petty cares and transient pleasures, were a cruel mockery. To talk of the past was to torture him with vain remorse. To refer to the future was to increase his anguish. And yet to be silent was to leave him a prey to his own regrets and apprehensions. Often he dwelt with shuddering minuteness on the fate of his perishing clay, the slow piecemeal dissolution already invading his frame, the shroud, the coffin, the dark lonely grave, and all the horrors of corruption.
If I try,
said his afflicted wife,
to divert him from these things, to raise his thoughts to higher themes, it is no better.
Worse and worse,
he groans.
If there be really life beyond the tomb and judgment after death, how can I face it?
I cannot do him any good. He will neither be enlightened, nor roused, nor comforted by anything I say. And yet he clings to me with unrelenting pertinacity, with a kind of childish desperation, as if I could save him from the fate he dreads. He keeps me night and day beside him. He is holding my left hand now, while I write. He has held it thus for hours, sometimes quietly, with his pale face upturned to mine, sometimes clutching my arm with violence, the big drops starting from his forehead at the thoughts of what he sees, or thinks he sees, before him. If I withdraw my hand for a moment, it distresses him.
Stay with me, Helen,
he says.
Let me hold you so it seems as if harm could not reach me while you are here. But death will come. It is coming now, fast, fast. And oh, if I could believe that there was nothing after.
Don't try to believe it, Arthur. There is joy and glory after, if you will but try to reach it.
What, for me?
He said, with something like a laugh.
Are we not to be judged according to the deeds done in the body? Where's the use of probationary existence if a man may spend it as he pleases, just contrary to God's decree, and then go to heaven with the best? If the vilest sinner may win the reward of the holiest saint by merely saying, I repent.
But if you sincerely repent?
I can't repent, I only fear.
You only regret the past for its consequences to yourself.
Just so, except that I'm sorry to have wronged you now, because you're so good to me.
Think of the goodness of God, and you cannot but be grieved to have offended him.
What is God? I cannot see him or hear him. God is only an idea.
God is infinite wisdom, and power, and goodness, and love. But if this idea is too vast for your human faculties, if your mind loses itself in its overwhelming infinitude, fix it on him who condescended to take our nature upon him, who was raised to heaven, even in his glorified human body, in whom the fullness of the Godhead shines." But he only shook his head and sighed. Then, in another paroxysm of shuddering horror, he tightened his grasp on my hand and arm, and groaning and lamenting, still clung to me with that wild, desperate earnestness, so harrowing to my soul, because I know I cannot help him. I did my best to soothe and comfort him.
"Death is so terrible,"
he cried.
"I cannot bear it. You don't know, Helen, you can't imagine what it is, because you haven't it before you. And when I'm buried, you'll return to your old ways and be as happy as ever. And all the world will go on just as busy and merry as if I'd never been while I—"
He burst into tears. "You needn't let that distress you," I said. "We shall all follow you soon enough."
"I wish to God I could take you with me now,"
he exclaimed.
"You should plead for me."
"No man can deliver his brother, nor make agreement unto God for him," I replied. "It cost more to redeem their souls. It cost the blood of an incarnate God, perfect and sinless in himself, to redeem us from the bondage of the evil one. Let him plead for you." But I seemed to speak in vain. He does not now, as formerly, laugh these blessed truths to scorn, but still he cannot trust, or will not comprehend them. He cannot linger long. He suffers dreadfully, and so do those that wait upon him. But I will not harass you with further details. I have said enough, I think, to convince you that I did well to go to him.
Poor, poor Helen! Dreadful indeed her trials must have been, and I could do nothing to lessen them. Nay, it almost seemed as if I had brought them upon her myself, by my own secret desires, and whether I looked at her husband's sufferings or her own, it seemed almost like a judgment upon myself for having cherished such a wish. The next day but one there came another letter. That, too, was put into my hands without a remark, and these are its contents.
December 5th. He is gone at last. I sat beside him all night, with my hand fast looked in his, watching the changes of his features, and listening to his failing breath. He had been silent a long time, and I thought he would never speak again, when he murmured, faintly but distinctly,
"Pray for me, Helen."
"I do pray for you, every hour and every minute, Arthur, but you must pray for yourself." His lips moved, but emitted no sound. Then his looks became unsettled, and from the incoherent, half-uttered words that escaped him from time to time, supposing him to be now unconscious, I gently disengaged my hand from his, intending to steal away for a breath of air, for I was almost ready to faint. But a convulsive movement of the fingers, and a faintly whispered,
"Don't leave me,"
immediately recalled me. I took his hand again, and held it till he was no more, and then I fainted. It was not grief, it was exhaustion that, till then, I had been enabled successfully to combat. Oh, Frederick, none can imagine the miseries, bodily and mental, of that deathbed. How could I endure to think that that poor trembling soul was hurried away to everlasting torment? It would drive me mad. But, thank God, I have hope. Not only from a vague dependence on the possibility that penitence and pardon might have reached him at the last, but from the blessed confidence that, through whatever purging fires the erring spirit may be doomed to pass, whatever fate awaits it, still it is not lost, and God, who hateth nothing that he hath made, will bless it in the end. His body will be consigned on Thursday to that dark grave he so much dreaded, but the coffin must be closed as soon as possible. If you will attend the funeral, come quickly, for I need help. Helen Huntingdon.
End of chapter 49. Of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, by Anne Bronte. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
On reading this, I had no reason to disguise my joy and hope from Frederick Lawrence, for I had none to be ashamed of. I felt no joy but that his sister was at length released from her afflictive, overwhelming toil, no hope but that she would in time recover from the effects of it, and be suffered to rest in peace and quietness, at least, for the remainder of her life. I experienced a painful commiseration for her unhappy husband, though fully aware that he had brought every particle of his sufferings upon himself, and but too well deserved them all, and a profound sympathy for her own afflictions, and a deep anxiety for the consequences of those harassing cares, those dreadful vigils, that incessant and deleterious confinement beside a living corpse, for I was persuaded she had not hinted half the sufferings she had had to endure. "You will go to her, Lawrence," said I, as I put the letter into his hand.
Yes, immediately.
"That's right. I'll leave you then, to prepare for your departure."
I've done that already, while you were reading the letter, and before you came, and the carriage is now coming round to the door.
Inly approving his promptitude, I bade him good morning, and withdrew. He gave me a searching glance, as we pressed each other's hands at parting, but whatever he sought in my countenance, he saw there nothing but the most becoming gravity. It might be mingled with a little sternness in momentary resentment at what I suspected to be passing in his mind. Had I forgotten my own prospects, my ardent love, my pertinacious hopes? It seemed like sacrilege to revert to them now, but I had not forgotten them. It was, however, with a gloomy sense of the darkness of those prospects, the fallacy of those hopes, and the vanity of that affection, that I reflected on those things as I remounted my horse and slowly journeyed homewards. Mrs. Huntingdon was free now. It was no longer a crime to think of her. But did she ever think of me? Not now. Of course it was not to be expected. But would she, when the shock was over? In all the course of her correspondence with her brother, our mutual friend, as she herself had called him, she had never mentioned me but once, and that was from necessity. This alone afforded strong presumption that I was already forgotten. Yet this was not the worst. It might have been her sense of duty that had kept her silent. She might be only trying to forget. But in addition to this, I had a gloomy conviction that the awful realities she had seen and felt, her reconciliation with the man she had once loved, his dreadful sufferings and death, must eventually efface from her mind all traces of her passing love for me. She might recover from these horrors so far as to be restored to her former health, her tranquillity, her cheerfulness even, but never to those feelings which would appear to her henceforth as a fleeting fancy, a vain, elusive dream, especially as there was no one to remind her of my existence, no means of assuring her of my fervent constancy, now that we were so far apart, and delicacy forbade me to see her or to write to her, for months to come at least. And how could I engage her brother in my behalf? How could I break that icy crust of shy reserve? Perhaps he would disapprove of my attachment now as highly as before. Perhaps he would think me too poorly, too lowly born, to match with his sister. Yes, there was another barrier. Doubtless there was a wide distinction between the rank and circumstances of Mrs. Huntingdon, the lady of Grassdale Manor, and those of Mrs. Graham the artist, the tenant of Wildfell Hall, and it might be deemed presumption in me to offer my hand to the former, by the world, by her friends, if not by herself, a penalty I might brave, if I were certain she loved me, but otherwise how could I? And finally her deceased husband, with his usual selfishness, might have so constructed his will as to place restrictions upon her marrying again, so that you see I had reasons enough for despair if I chose to indulge it. Nevertheless, it was with no small degree of impatience that I looked forward to Mr. Lawrence's return from Grassdale, impatience that increased in proportion as his absence was prolonged. He stayed away some 10 or 12 days. All very right that he should remain to comfort and help his sister, but he might have written to tell me how she was, or at least to tell me when to expect his return, for he might have known I was suffering tortures of anxiety for her, and uncertainty for my own future prospects. And when he did return, all he told me about her was that she had been greatly exhausted and worn by her unremitting exertions in behalf of that man who had been the scourge of her life, and had dragged her with him nearly to the portals of the grave, and was still much shaken and depressed by his melancholy end, and the circumstances attendant upon it. But no word in reference to me, no intimation that my name had ever passed her lips, or even been spoken in her presence. To be sure, I asked no questions on the subject. I could not bring my mind to do so, believing as I did that Lawrence was indeed averse to the idea of my union with his sister. I saw that he expected to be further questioned concerning his visit, and I saw too, with a keen perception of awakened jealousy or alarmed self-esteem, or by whatever name I ought to call it, that he rather shrank from that impending scrutiny, and was no less pleased than surprised to find it did not come. Of course I was burning with anger, but pride obliged me to suppress my feelings, and preserve a smooth face, or at least a stoic calmness, throughout the interview. It was well it did, for, reviewing the matter in my sober judgment, I must say it would have been highly absurd and improper to have quarrelled with him on such an occasion. I must confess, too, that I wronged him in my heart. The truth was, he liked me very well, but he was fully aware that a union between Mrs. Huntingdon and me would be what the world calls a misalliance, and it was not in his nature to set the world at defiance, especially in such a case as this, for its dread laugh or ill opinion would be far more terrible to him directed against his sister than himself. Had he believed that a union was necessary to the happiness of both, or of either, or had he known how fervently I loved her, he would have acted differently. But seeing me so calm and cool, he would not for the world disturb my philosophy, and though refraining entirely from any active opposition to the match, he would yet do nothing to bring it about, and would much rather take the part of prudence in aiding us to overcome our mutual predilections than that of feeling to encourage them. And he was in the right of it, you will say. Perhaps he was. At any rate, I had no business to feel so bitterly against him as I did. But I could not then regard the matter in such a moderate light, and after a brief conversation upon indifferent topics I went away, suffering all the pangs of wounded pride and injured friendship, in addition to those resulting from the fear that I was indeed forgotten, and the knowledge that she I loved was alone and afflicted, suffering from injured health and dejected spirits, and I was forbidden to console or assist her, forbidden even to assure her of my sympathy, for the transmission of any such message through Mr. Lawrence was now completely out of the question. But what should I do? I would wait and see if she would notice me, which of course she would not, unless by some kind message entrusted to her brother, that in all probability he would not deliver, and then, dreadful thought, she would think me cooled and changed for not returning it, or perhaps he had already given her to understand that I had ceased to think of her. I would wait, however, till the 6 months after our parting were fairly past, which would be about the close of February, and then I would send her a letter, modestly reminding her of her former permission to write to her at the close of that period, and hoping I might avail myself of it, at least to express my heartfelt sorrow for her late afflictions, my just appreciation of her generous conduct, and my hope that her health was now completely re-established, and that she would some time be permitted to enjoy those blessings of a peaceful, happy life, which had been denied her so long, but which none could more truly be said to merit than herself, adding a few words of kind remembrance to my little friend Arthur, with a hope that he had not forgotten me, and perhaps a few more in reference to bygone times, to the delightful hours I had passed in her society, and my unfading recollection of them, which was the salt and solace of my life, and a hope that her recent troubles had not entirely banished me from her mind. If she did not answer this, of course I should write no more. If she did, as surely she would in some fashion, my future proceedings should be regulated by her reply. 10 weeks was long to wait in such a miserable state of uncertainty, but courage, it must be endured, and meantime I would continue to see Lawrence now and then, though not so often as before, and I would still pursue my habitual inquiries after his sister, if he had lately heard from her, and how she was, but nothing more. I did so, and the answers I received were always provokingly limited to the letter of the inquiry. She was much as usual, she made no complaints, but the tone of her last letter evinced great depression of mind. She said she was better, and finally she said she was well, and very busy with her son's education, and with the management of her late husband's property, and the regulation of his affairs. The rascal had never told me how that property was disposed, or whether Mr. Huntingdon had died intestate or not, and I would sooner die than ask him, lest he should misconstrue into covetousness my desire to know. He never offered to show me his sister's letters now, and I never hinted a wish to see them. February, however, was approaching. December was past. January at length was almost over. A few more weeks, and then certain despair or renewal of hope would put an end to this long agony of suspense. But alas, it was just about that time she was called to sustain another blow in the death of her uncle, a worthless old fellow enough in himself, I dare say, but he had always shown more kindness and affection to her than to any other creature, and she had always been accustomed to regard him as a parent. She was with him when he died, and had assisted her aunt to nurse him during the last stage of his illness. Her brother went to Stanningley to attend the funeral, and told me upon his return that she was still there, endeavouring to cheer her aunt with her presence, and likely to remain some time. This was bad news for me, for while she continued there I could not write to her, as I did not know the address, and would not ask it of him. But week followed week, and every time I inquired about her, she was still at Stanningley. "Where is Stanningley?" I asked at last.
"In shire,"
was the brief reply, and there was something so cold and dry in the manner of it, that I was effectually deterred from requesting a more definite account. When will she return to Grassdale? Was my next question.
"I don't know."
"Confound it!" I muttered.
"Why, Markham?"
asked my companion, with an air of innocent surprise, but I did not deign to answer him, save by a look of silent, sullen contempt, at which he turned away, and contemplated the carpet with a slight smile, half pensive, half amused. But quickly looking up, he began to talk of other subjects, trying to draw me into a cheerful and friendly conversation, but I was too much irritated to discourse with him, and soon took leave. You see, Lawrence and I somehow could not manage to get on very well together. The fact is, I believe, we were both of us a little too touchy. It is a troublesome thing, Halford, this susceptibility to affronts where none are intended. I am no martyr to it now, as you can bear me witness. I have learned to be merry and wise, to be more easy with myself and more indulgent to my neighbours, and I can afford to laugh at both Lawrence and you, partly from accident, partly from wilful negligence on my part, for I was really beginning to dislike him. Several weeks elapsed before I saw my friend again. When we did meet, it was he that sought me out. One bright morning, early in June, he came into the field where I was just commencing my hay harvest.
"It is long since I saw you, Markham,"
said he, after the first few words had passed between us.
"Do you never mean to come to Woodford again?"
"I called once, and you were out."
"I was sorry, but that was long since. I hoped you would call again. And now I have called, and you are out, which you generally are, or I would do myself the pleasure of calling more frequently. But being determined to see you this time, I have left my pony in the lane, and come over the hedge and ditch to join you, for I am about to leave Woodford for a while, and may not have the pleasure of seeing you again for a month or two."
"Where are you going?"
"To Grassdale first,"
said he, with a half smile he would willingly have suppressed if he could. "To Grassdale? Is she there, then?"
"Yes, but in a day or two she will leave it to accompany Mrs. Maxwell to F for the benefit of the sea air, and I shall go with them."
F was at that time a quiet but respectable watering place. It is considerably more frequented now. Lawrence seemed to expect me to take advantage of the circumstance to entrust him with some sort of a message to his sister, and I believe he would have undertaken to deliver it, without any material objections, if I had had the sense to ask him, though of course he would not offer to do so, if I was content to let it alone. but I could not bring myself to make the request, and it was not till after he was gone that I saw how fair an opportunity I had lost, and then indeed I deeply regretted my stupidity and my foolish pride, but it was now too late to remedy the evil. He did not return till towards the latter end of August. He wrote to me twice or thrice from F, but his letters were most provokingly unsatisfactory, dealing in generalities or in trifles that I cared nothing about, or replete with fancies and reflections equally unwelcome to me at the time, saying next to nothing about his sister and little more about himself. I would wait, however, till he came back. Perhaps I could get something more out of him then. At all events, I would not write to her now, while she was with him and her aunt, who doubtless would be still more hostile to my presumptuous aspirations than himself. When she was returned to the silence and solitude of her own home, it would be my fittest opportunity. When Lawrence came, however, he was as reserved as ever on the subject of my keen anxiety. He told me that his sister had derived considerable benefit from her stay at F, that her son was quite well, and alas, that both of them were gone with Mrs. Maxwell back to Stanningley, and there they stayed at least 3 months. But instead of boring you with my chagrin, my expectations and disappointments, my fluctuations of dull despondency and flickering hope, my varying resolutions, now to drop it, and now to persevere, now to make a bold push, and now to let things pass, and patiently abide my time, I will employ myself in settling the business of one or two of the characters introduced in the course of this narrative, whom I may not have occasion to mention again. Some time before Mr. Huntingdon's death, Lady Loughborough eloped with another gallant to the Continent, where, having lived a while in reckless gaiety and dissipation, they quarrelled and parted. She went dashing on for a season, but years came and money went. She sunk at length in difficulty and debt, disgrace and misery, and died at last, as I have heard, in penury, neglect, and utter wretchedness. But this might be only a report. She may be living yet, for anything I, or any of her relatives, or former acquaintances, can tell, for they have all lost sight of her long years ago, and would as thoroughly forget her, if they could. Her husband, however, upon this second misdemeanour, immediately sought and obtained a divorce, and not long after married again. It was well he did, for Lord Loughborough, morose and moody as he seemed, was not the man for a bachelor's life. No public interests, no ambitious projects, or active pursuits, or ties of friendship even, if he had had any friends, could compensate to him for the absence of domestic comforts and endearments. He had a son and a nominal daughter, it is true, but they too painfully reminded him of their mother, and the unfortunate little Annabella was a source of perpetual bitterness to his soul. He had obliged himself to treat her with paternal kindness. He had forced himself not to hate her, and even perhaps to feel some degree of kindly regard for her, at last, in return for her artless and unsuspecting attachment to himself. But the bitterness of his self-condemnation for his inward feelings towards that innocent being, his constant struggles to subdue the evil promptings of his nature, for it was not a generous one, though partly guessed at by those who knew him, could be known to God and his own heart alone. So also was the hardness of his conflicts with the temptation to return to the vice of his youth, and seek oblivion for past calamities, and deadness to the present misery of a blighted heart, a joyless, friendless life, and a morbidly disconsolate mind, by yielding again to that insidious foe to health, and sense, and virtue, which had so deplorably enslaved and degraded him before. The second object of his choice was widely different from the first. Some wondered at his taste, some even ridiculed it, but in this their folly was more apparent than his. The lady was about his own age, i.e. between 30 and 40, remarkable neither for beauty, nor wealth, nor brilliant accomplishments, nor any other thing that I ever heard of, except genuine good sense, unswerving integrity, active piety, warm-hearted benevolence, and a fund of cheerful spirits. These qualities, however, as you may readily imagine, combined to render her an excellent mother to the children, and an invaluable wife to his lordship. He, with his usual self-deprecation, thought her a world too good for him, and while he wondered at the kindness of Providence in conferring such a gift upon him, and even at her taste in preferring him to other men, he did his best to reciprocate the good she did him, and so far succeeded that she was, and I believe still is, one of the happiest and fondest wives in England. And all who question the good taste of either partner may be thankful if their respective selections afford them half the genuine satisfaction in the end, or repay their preference with affection half as lasting and sincere. If you are at all interested in the fate of that low scoundrel Grimsby, I can only tell you that he went from bad to worse, sinking from bathos to bathos of vice and villainy, consorting only with the worst members of his club and the lowest dregs of society, happily for the rest of the world, and at last met his end in a drunken brawl, from the hands, it is said, of some brother scoundrel he had cheated at play. As for Mr. Hattersley, he had never wholly forgotten his resolution to come out from among them, and behave like a man and a Christian, and the last illness and death of his once jolly friend Huntingdon so deeply and seriously impressed him with the evil of their former practices, that he never needed another lesson of the kind. Avoiding the temptations of the town, he continued to pass his life in the country, immersed in the usual pursuits of a hearty, active country gentleman, his occupations being those of farming and breeding horses and cattle, diversified with a little hunting and shooting, and enlivened by the occasional companionship of his friends, better friends than those of his youth, and the society of his happy little wife, now cheerful and confiding as heart could wish, and his fine family of stalwart sons and blooming daughters. His father, the banker, having died some years ago and left him all his riches, he has now full scope for the exercise of his prevailing tastes, and I need not tell you that Ralph Hattersley, Esquire, is celebrated throughout the country for his noble breed of horses.
End of chapter 50.